Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our latest lecture. Our subject this evening is the use of extrasensory perception in intelligence gathering. Our speaker is Dr. Edwin May. Dr. May has a PhD in nuclear physics and worked for 12 years in that field. He then became interested in applying his skills to a serious study of ESP. He joined the Stanford Research Institute in 1975 and in 1985 became the director of the US government ESP program, a position he held for some 10 years. He has a very serious approach to this study, which has been to apply the best science methodology to this research. The research continues under foundation funding and is currently director of the Laboratories for Fundamental Research in California. I'm sure we can look forward to a most interesting insight into this intriguing and indeed controversial subject. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. May.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I would like to thank the organizers for being so kind to invite me here to talk to you this evening. And secondly, just a brief personal note. I'm 65 years old, which means I can remember my father going off to war, albeit the Pacific, and so those memories are vague in my mind, but in later life I've become a very amateur historian over places like this, so it's a special privilege for me to be here to talk to you about this interesting topic this evening, and thank you. Okay, I have a fascinating story to tell you, and this will give you a broad overview. It has in no way intent to convince you one way or the other about the existence of extrasensory perception. The fact is, we used it almost on a daily basis. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And by the end of the 40 minutes or so, you'll gain some insight as what it looked like when it in fact did work. So I'm going to tell you what our overall mission is, then give you a brief history. Clearly, I can't summarize 17 years worth of project, or 20 years worth of project in a space of 40 minutes. So this is an extraordinarily brief, I should underline, history. How one would approach studying this phenomenon in the laboratory, this phenomenon being extrasensory perception. Give you some examples, and as physicists like to say, there are typical best evers. They're gee whizzes, and I'll be honest with you and tell you when it didn't work as well, but the ones I've selected are designed to, as we say in California, knock your socks off, so please make sure they're in good shape. And analysis of operational missions, how we actually applied this in the days of the Cold War, and how we were approached to help solve some of those problems. So let's get on with it. The missions in history. We had a threefold mission throughout the entire length of the project. First, to help gather intelligence. Secondly, if we could do it, ostensibly, so could they, whoever they happened to be in the Cold War. So part of our mission was threat assessment of foreign activity. Did it involve any threat to the US military and to the intelligence community? Lastly, and a very small portion in the beginning, applied and basic research. Applied research is, well, what methodologies can we do to make the output better so we can provide a better intelligence product? That's applied research. The basic research, which was almost non-existent in the early days, was, well, how does it actually work? So we did a little of that. Very brief history. Dr. Harold Puthoff and Mr. Russell Targ started this program under a CIA contract in 1972 at what was then called Stanford Research Institute. Now it's called SRI International. In those days, it was actually part of Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. This is the kind of money that was spent during that period, and at the low point, there were 3 employees, and at the high point, in 1985, we had a staff of 12 people working full-time in support of the military and intelligence community. In the 1990 to 1995 time, we spent this amount of money, and we had 5 full-time staff, but continued on supporting the activity up until basically the end, and a little bit past the end of the Cold War. And as the requirements changed, it became less important for us doing what we were doing. In terms of publications, even today, there's roughly 100,000 pages of classified material still protected, and from my point of view, will remain that way for some time. This doesn't sound like many research papers out of such a long project, but as you will see, at the time we couldn't submit our work to peer-reviewed journals. But since the close of the program in 1995, program has produced about 25 peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature. So that's the history. Thank you for coming up. No, I guess we'll continue on. Secrets past and present. From 1972 to 1989, everything was secret, or formally classified even higher. We couldn't even admit to people within our own organization what we were doing. As you might expect, heavily compartmentalized program, which made it a little bit difficult when we were all getting background investigations to get our clearances, because somebody would knock on the door of our neighbor and say, I'm from the CIA or from the FBI, and I'm investigating this bloke, Ed May, what kind of a guy he is. And their eyes would get about this big around, and we'd have to say, well, everybody at SRI has to have clearances, and find out some clever way to avoid direct questions. It was rather difficult in that era. In 1989, however, I was able to convince the Army that all of the research, applied and basic research, should be declassified retroactively, and that is still true today. But most everything else, how we applied this under operational conditions, the results of that activity, what the operational targets were, all of that is still quite sensitive for quite obvious reasons. From 1996 to the date, some funding sources have been released as to who funded this program, but most of those have not been released. And so there's still an air of secrecy over this program, as well it should be. It's not there just because of this so-called high giggle factor. And I hope I can convince you of that as we move along. Before I move into the laboratory approach, I didn't say that I became the director for the research portion of or what's called the contractor portion of the project in 1985. So on my watch, it lasted 10 years. I think we had something like 85% of the funding at that time, and roughly the results that we got was proportional to the funding. And this was based on, built on the shoulders of some really excellent people who were working on the project prior to my joining it. So, to give you a little background of how you would study extrasensory perception in the laboratory, the first thing we do is change its name. I mean, for political reasons, but more importantly, extrasensory perception has built into it, with these names you probably recognize, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and so on, an applied mechanism. Is it extra? Is it sensory? We don't know enough about it at this stage to be able to put those meaningful labels on. Rather, we wanted to invent a term that was as descriptive as possible of what the observable was in the laboratory. And so we invented this term. Cognition, of course, means to become aware, and people become aware of things in ways we don't currently understand, and thus the term anomalous. And we think at this point that describes the phenomenon in as a model-free terminology as possible. Okay, so here's how it might work in the laboratory. It takes 4 people to do this, actually 3 people to do this in the laboratory. A so-called psychic, we'll call that woman a receiver, a monitor, and at 10 o'clock they're locked away in a soundproof laboratory. Not always, but sometimes. And at 10:05, a computer accesses a random number generator, not ever a roulette wheel, but that was nice I could find from PowerPoint, and selects randomly one photograph out of a predefined set of 300. Here's an example of one. Recognizable building, Stanford University, no, I don't think so. At this point, the assumption is that these two people have memorized, this is the assumption, it's not true, but have memorized all 300 pictures. What they are blind about is which one the computer actually chose. So in scientific jargon, this is called a double-blind procedure. The experimenter and the so-called experiment subject, neither of whom know what the answer is. So at this point, then, the monitor is free to engage this person in a 15-minute sort of stylized interview. And over the years, we've developed techniques on how to do that. It sounds like we know what we're doing. The answer is we really don't know what we're doing, so I'll call it a ritual rather than a protocol. But it evolved in a way that appeared to work for 20-some-odd years. So we still use it. Some fraction of the time, a little miracle happens. This person gets a mental image picture of what's in her mind with regard to this photograph. It's hardly ever that good, and you'll see some examples, but that illustrates what's going on. This, I might add, is not an analysis. This is simply how we collect the data in a laboratory setting. Leaving aside all the security precautions, not governmental security, but fraud security, so people can't cheat when they find out the answer and so on, we actually show this person what the actual intended target was. All right, here's a real example of an Apple Corporation engineer that had never done this before, and I'll translate some of the scribbling. He said, intersection, notch or groove, and drew this big X. Looking down, wave, seawall, gap. This is the sum total of this very skeptical Apple engineer. He didn't believe ESP at all, and that's what he drew. And I would challenge you, as well as myself, looking at this, I have absolutely no idea what the picture is. So I have to report to you a very depressing idea, that even as good as ESP is, it will never replace British Telecom as a way of communicating. That's an important statement. So if you're looking at this, forget it. There's no way you can figure out what the actual target photograph might have been. So then how would we, in fact, analyze this? Well, you're going to get your chance. Here I've reproduced this. I know you can't read these signs. And here are 5 photographs that have been chosen in advance before the session went on. One of these 5 photographs is the actual target picture this viewer was trying to perceive by ESP methods. I don't know which one. I do, but I'm not telling. You don't know which one. But when I was the analyst for this trial, of course, I was blind as an analyst also. So it's not as easy as it might look. For example, there's waves. Well, there's waves. There's an X, but heck, that could be considered X as well. There it says seawall. Well, that's not a seawall, come on, but it is water falling down a wall of rock. So why couldn't we consider that a seawall? And of course, this looks like looking down on a city block. So what is the poor analyst, all of you, to do? Your job is to look at this picture, these drawings, and I've not edited them, that was everything they did, and say, which one of these is the best possible match, even though none of them are a really good match. Just for the fun of it, how many people think the palm trees are the best match? Show of hands? 1. 2. How about this one? Show of hands. How many people think, you guys are easy? I might have set you up. But when I did this, I chose this as my first place match, thinking that was the best match here. Then I said, well, this one is not a bad second match, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and so on. And in fact, we were all correct for this particular trial. This demonstrates, this is a statistically sound, valid way that has been examined by statistical skeptics and skeptical psychologists as what's called a within-trial control to make a valid assessment as to some degree of information transfer at times we all think it should not. I don't know if you've heard about what is called a lucid dream. We all have dreams, and sometimes we remember them and sometimes not. But a PhD candidate and then later PhD awarded individual at Stanford University decided to study for his thesis a lucid dream. A lucid dream is a dream that while you're having your dream, you become aware that what you are experiencing is, quote, just a dream. What's remarkable about that, in the Stanford University Sleep Laboratory, they monitor movement of your eyes by putting electrodes right here. And before you go to sleep, they say, well, if you realize it's a dream, look at your right shoulder, look at your left shoulder, look at your right shoulder, look at your left shoulder in your dream. And what that actually does is move your eyeballs. And that shows up on the strip chart for the people who are awake watching. So as odd as it may sound, there is a whole category of academic study where people become aware that they're dreaming, and so on. So in this particular trial, we had an individual, and we wired him up at the Stanford Sleep Laboratory with EEG and respiration and all the stuff, so you could tell that they were in fact asleep. And we said, look, this guy's name was Joe. When you become aware that what you're experiencing is a dream, signal us. Get out of your dream bed, walk down the dream corridor into the adjacent dream laboratory, in which you'll find a photograph on the wall in an envelope, a dream envelope. Open that envelope, study what the contents, retrace your steps, wiggle your eyes, we'll wake you up and you can tell us what's there. So, as crazy as that seems, Dr. LaBerge does this routinely in his normal research. So this is what our fellow drew. He said, key mountains, barn, or large cabin shadow, shadows of mountains, trees, and roads. And I'm just translating some of that. He says, a path here, American Rockies, or maybe the Alps. But he did report when we woke him up, he said, you know, I did everything he asked me to do, got into the laboratory, and I couldn't find that stupid envelope. But I know it's a dream, so like Dorothy in Kansas, he clicked his heels together and said, I'm now going to go and stand where the photographer stood who took the picture that's in the envelope I can't find. And he did that. That's what's nice about lucid dreaming. You can, in fact, move yourself all around. And that's what he did. And the picture that was in the envelope was, ta-da, that. And frankly, with me looking at this picture, I couldn't do such a good job of drawing it. So because I'm a skeptical scientist, I said to Joe after the session, you know, next time get it right, you missed the car, for crying out loud. This is the other end of the scale. The first example I showed you was simply a novice who had never done it before, which is quite typical. This is an expert that we've been working with since 1978, and 20% only of his work is of this quality. The fact that 20% of it is that quality is absolutely astounding from my point of view. Statistically, it's off the charts, because roughly when we do this, 20% is chance, what we'd expect by chance, and this man's lifetime's average of getting the right answer is 44%. That doesn't sound like much, but it is extraordinary when it comes to statistics. Now, I notice you're all wide awake, so I'm going to put up 4 slides. No, I'm not, to put you to sleep. For those who are interested in statistics, here is an article by Professor Utz, a statistician. In 1991, she analyzed all the work. It's now grossly out of date. But the bottom line is, well, these numbers is, it looks like a genuine information transfer anomaly we simply do not understand. Okay, now we move off. I want to set the stage from a point of view to give you an idea of how it would work in the laboratory, that you can do good science with it, even though it's quite ephemeral. Nonetheless, our military clients wanted to know how good this phenomenon would be against directed energy weapon systems. Because during the Cold War, as you all realize, that was a real tough question. There were places, the bad guys, whoever they were, they wouldn't move them out so satellites could see them, and so a lot of these targets were underground, and so there was a debate within the U.S. intelligence community as to what was going on in a lot of these things, strategic targets usually. And so this was a test bed against known ground truth, to use jargon. In other words, sites that we knew everything about in the US. And I'll roughly run through the protocol. We only did 2 trials 1 year apart. This is the only remote viewer that we have that has released his name to the public, somewhat over my objection. There are 9 others that can produce the data of the same quality that you see here, and all of them still remain protected. For each one of these trials, what we had was the Social Security number, which is just a 9-digit number that everybody who works in the States gets. And so that's all we had of an individual none of us had ever met. Now, as the project director, I knew what was going on, but every person that came in contact with Mr. McMonigle was blind to what the target circumstances were, was blind as to who the funders were. It was like a laboratory study, even though we never used it as such. And I won't describe the complicated arithmetic on how we do the fuzzy set analysis, only to tell you that the client, the military client, said, here's what we're interested in if this thing works. If the person can really get in touch with this directed energy weapon system, then here are the things we're interested in. The fraction of those that we got right is called the accuracy. If the guy's good, if the remote viewer is good, then it's 100% accurate. But if you think about it, if you read the Encyclopedia Britannica as your response, you'll guarantee get 100% accuracy because you'll actually eventually mention everything there is to mention. So that's not enough. The other term then, and there are formal mathematical descriptions of these things, but it's easier to understand, reliability. That is, if this guy is a reliable source, a reliable asset, to use an intelligence term, then most of what that person says is going to be useful or helpful or correct. So this represents the percent of what someone says is correct. This represents the percent of the intended target that was described correctly. The product of those 2 numbers give us a reasonably good measure. Now here you're thinking to yourself, aha, the monkey on a typewriter problem. Roughly 1/3 of what anybody says will roughly match 1/3 of any place. So 1/3 times 1/3 is like 0.09, or 0.1 is the product you would expect by just chance. We looked at 2 systems a year apart. One was a 50 million electron volt electron accelerator at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and a year later a 1 gigahertz microwave generator in the deserts of near Albuquerque. And the accuracy and reliability figures here even surprised me in terms of their size and, more importantly, their consistency. Roughly 80% of what the client wanted us to describe, we described, and roughly 80% of what he said was correct. And about a year later, plus or minus, it was about the same. That was remarkable. You'll see some examples of this case here. This was very classified until quite recently, these trials. There's a lot there, and I'm just going to roughly tell you. Here, he said 6 by 4 centimeters right there. Had he said inches, he would have been exactly correct. Got his units screwed up. Anybody who knows about microwaves would immediately recognize that drawing as a microwave waveguide. Wrapped environment, he said, energy coming out, measurement of shock waves, wave front emitter, general effects overall evaluator. I'm just translating what he wrote on the page. This was 1,500 kilometers away from us from Palo Alto, and this was a project then called Project Rose, 1 gigahertz microwave generator. As it turns out, the divergent microwave beam coming out of the front of this thing is roughly exactly that angle. I think that's probably just lucky. But what they were doing here was destructive testing of electronics downstream. And that's, in essence, what he had to say here with these gadgets. So if you didn't know anything else, and our asset described all of this, and you wanted to know whether it was a rocket production facility, a nuclear power plant, or a microwave facility, the minimum that you would say is, let's turn other assets on this problem that are directed toward looking at microwaves. And that was the true value of the kinds of intelligence that we produced. We had a law enforcement case. Most of them didn't work, so I'm going to show you one that did. U.S. custom agent went bad. This fellow was buying and selling drugs from the drug people in Florida, which is not a good thing if you're a custom agent. And there was a nationwide manhunt for this fellow. And the idea was that he loved boats, he loved water. So the manhunt was focused on the Caribbean in the boats, in the water area. That's what all this was about, common wisdom. But the person that provided the ESP data to try to find this said, no, nothing doing. You're going to find him in a campground south of Yellowstone National Park, 1,500 kilometers or miles actually to the nearest ocean. And using ESP and other set of data, they went to that location and caught him. And what we have here is about a 90-second film that was aired on U.S. national news. So it takes a little while to start it up. Be patient here.
One case where psychic spies say they played a critical role was in 1989. Charles Jordan was a U.S. Customs agent gone bad, a dangerous fugitive who had eluded police for 2 years.
The collective wisdom at the time, including from everybody I talked to, was that he was probably in the Caribbean.
We were called into the case, and one of our project viewers started describing him in northern Wyoming, and described an area at a campground, having close to an Indian burial site.
Using this and other information, Jordan was finally caught
In Wyoming, near a national park, and near the Grand Tetons, near Yellowstone, next to an Indian reservation, next to an Indian gravesite.
We like to count it as a success.
It was almost, the word spooky or something. Here's the guy next to a famous gravesite, next to a reservation. It couldn't have been much more accurate than that.
As a sidebar, this guy worked for the U.S. Customs Department, called me and asked me for a job when this was over. I said, no, I think your retirement plan will be much better off staying where you are. But he did call, actually. This is one of the few genuine intelligence applications that have been released. This was targeted by geographical coordinates. All the remote viewer had was the geographical coordinates of a suspected nuclear weapons development site called Semipalatinsk in what is now Kazakhstan. And the first thing that the person drew was a very large crane. And he said, this crane is so large, you could drive it across a building, and a person would only come up to half a wheel height. This is an artist's conception of a satellite photograph, and there's the crane. And here's a person. This crane goes across here. The remote viewer, now deceased, named Pat Price, generated probably a stack of responses that deep about this particular site. Roughly 20 to 25% of that data was both unknown and later turned out to be accurate. The CIA was the client here, and the CIA knew about this crane. So it was the task to do this ESP trial was done by people who didn't know the crane was there, obviously. But nonetheless, they said, oh, wait a minute, this guy is in the neighborhood. There's a lot of other funny stories, but I have to leave them for another visit. This is my source, the Washington Post newspaper on this date, page 13. As far as I know, these are the only 3 operational activities on our project that have been declassified. A new Soviet boomer submarine was found out to be under construction, and that was primarily by an ESP, remote viewer, if you will. This is less likely as being a real match. A ship, this was, Pentagon asked a possible Libyan response to U.S. criticism of chemical weapons work in Rabta, and some of that appeared to be true. That's all I can say about it. There's a huge database. I would say roughly 20% of the tasks that we were given produced what I would call actionable intelligence. But here's a problem. Not only a problem for us, but it's a problem for intelligence-wide. That is, to first order, the intelligence value of any data, you may find surprising, is actually decoupled from the quality of the data. Let me give you an example. Suppose you don't know, but you've directed a spy in the sky satellite over some country, and all of a sudden you see right before you a brand new tank you'd never seen before. And you could practically count the rivets. It's such high quality pictures. It's wonderful. You're all excited. You run to your pal down the hall, and she tells you, oh, we forgot to tell you, one of our guys actually stole that tank, and it's in a barn over there in Virginia. And so that high quality, high resolution photograph of this ostensibly new piece of intelligence has zero intelligence value whatsoever. And the inverse of that is true. You get some overhead photograph of some fuzzy thing, you look at it, it looks like a box of Kleenex in a snowstorm, and there's just lousy data, and an analyst says, you know, that reminds me of something I saw last week, and goes to the file cabinet and cracks the case. So the intelligence value really is, at least to some degree, decoupled from the quality of the data, and that provided a major problem for us in trying to convince people to continue using our technique. Another problem that we had was the only time they called up those crazy psychics in California is when everything else failed. I mean, what can you lose, right? Now, let me tell you, if you're trying to evaluate something, that is the worst. Out of a long list of ways to evaluate something, that's really down there on the bottom. So the fact that we could produce 20 or 30 or so cases over all these years under those circumstances is extraordinary, at least I think so. So there were some serious management problems, that being one. I would love to be able to tell you all this is now going on in our world of terrorism and all of that, and that maybe, you know, I'm now out of the picture, I'm retired basically, and there's some other program going on, and of course that always might still be true, but I genuinely do not think so. And I don't think so because the people who are willing to push this program forward, even though the data at times were spectacular, put their careers, and sometimes lost their careers, backing us. This was a political hot potato. So, what we don't know as yet, which makes it troublesome for an intelligence asset, and that is when someone produces a glorious diagram, it might be completely wrong. And we have no indication in advance of whether it's going to be good, bad, or indifferent. That's a real troublesome problem. We have looked every way you can imagine at looking at a human being to try to figure out who are the psychic ones and who aren't. And all of those have failed. The only thing that hasn't failed, and I'll come back sometime next year and test every one of you in a room like this, is if you want to find someone who can do it, you ask everybody to do it and find the ones that can. Roughly 0.5% of the general population appear to be able to do this under laboratory condition. That sounds very tiny, but when you take 0.5% of a very large number, you get an almost large number. We have been simply unable to teach this skill to anybody. Not for lack of trying. We've wanted to, I sort of thinking we don't know enough about the procedure. We want to teach someone how to type, but we don't know enough about it yet. Hey, take off your boxing gloves. Maybe it'll be a little better. Something like that. This is a real troublesome part. We're not able yet to teach this to anybody. And please, please, do not go onto the internet and pay £1,000 for someone who will come here and teach you how to do remote viewing. They are, in fact, lying to you. However, with all this negativity, if you use this asset properly, and it was done so on a number of cases, it can contribute to, not solve, problems of national interest that are very, very important. And as all of you mostly realize, no intelligence wizard would ever have sole source on anything. And you certainly wouldn't sole source our material. But can we help? You bet. So I'll close with a little 11-minute movie. I think we have time. This is not a staged show. This was done with Mr. McMonigal as the remote viewer on a U.S. national program called Put to the Test. It aired on national television with the ABC network. It was real time. It happened as you will see it here in this film. They spent $150,000 US on this small segment, and they paid attention to the scientific advisor. Believe me, that's rare. We've done like 86 of these since this was done in 1994, and almost no one has paid attention to us. They've abused us, I might add. So let's see here. Ah.
Extrasensory perception, ESP. We've all heard of someone who says they have it, and scientists from around the world have spent decades trying to explain it. Well, you're about to meet a man who claims to possess this extraordinary ability and has allowed us to put him to the test. For most of his adult life, Joe McMoneagle was a professional soldier. 2 brutal tours of Vietnam, U.S. Army intelligence, a Legion of Merit award winner, a black and white world, clearly defined and limited to his 5 senses. But in 1970, Joe claims that world was turned inside out. In a restaurant, Joe suddenly felt ill and staggered outside. This is the first time he's told his story on television.
It was sort of a pop, and I found myself standing on a cobblestone road watching the rain go through my hands, and looked up and saw my body sort of half in, half out of a doorway. I knew at that point that I was probably dead.
Joe was rushed to a hospital, where he arrived showing no signs of life.
I felt as though I was falling backwards and was enveloped by a white light.
So here you are, you've almost died, and then all these strange things start happening to you. What's going through your mind?
It shattered all my concepts of reality. I started having spontaneous out-of-bodies. I'd lay down for a nap on the couch or something, and I just find myself suddenly out of my body somewhere else, totally.
Joe also claims he started having other unexplainable experiences, like knowing what complete strangers were thinking. For 8 years, he kept his extrasensory perceptions to himself. Unbeknownst to Joe, 3,000 miles across the country, this man, Dr. Edwin May, and a select group of investigative scientists were just beginning to study extrasensory perception, ESP.
When I first got involved with this, I was very skeptical. I said, if this is real, it's critically important. After 20 years, I've come to the conclusion something interesting is going on.
How do you study ESP in the lab? Well, scientists developed an experiment called remote viewing. The person being tested is placed in a closed room. A researcher then goes to an unknown location, and the subject is asked to use ESP to draw what that researcher is seeing. Over the past 20 years, Dr. May has conducted thousands of these remote viewing experiments. In 1978, he started testing Joe McMoneagle, and Dr. May claims Joe has drawn scores of unknown sights, 50% of the time with remarkable and unexplainable success.
In one of his best hits, we had a person that was in the administration building at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And all Joe drew was the laboratory, a perfect plan view of what this laboratory looks like. The interesting thing is, Joe's never been to Livermore. And this person could have been hiding anywhere in the entire continental USA. We've looked in the laboratory to figure out what's special about Joe. We've looked medically, neurophysiologically, physically, behaviorally, in every way one can look at a human being. And the good news is Joe is boringly normal like the rest of us. Well, what we are proposing is that there is a sixth, an additional sense, that is responsible for what Joe does in the laboratory and in the real world.
Does Joe McMoneagle actually have a sixth sense, a sense which cannot be explained? To test his abilities, we flew him here to Houston, a city to which he's never been. For Joe, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack. The needle, a random location. The haystack, the 5,436 square miles that make up Greater Houston. We hired a movie location scout who spent 5 days finding a wide variety of distinct target sites.
I think all of them have dramatic Houston elements with very defined architectural styles. And, you know, one of the things that I did not want to do is repeat any common denominator. I did not want there to be two archways. I didn't want there to be two triangles in the visual.
Following Dr. May's scientific protocol, the producers reduced the hundreds of possible sites down to 4. A life-size treehouse on the George Ranch. A visually dramatic portion of the theme park Astro World. The Ship Channel at the Port of Houston Authority. And a famous local landmark, the Water Wall. Without Joe's knowledge, those locations were photographed and placed in numbered envelopes at our downtown headquarters. We hired Officer Bill Baker of the Houston Police Department to retain custody of those envelopes. With Joe McMonigal sequestered in a windowless, soundproof room, we placed the 4 numbered envelopes in an adjacent room. To choose our final location, Julie Wiesen, a local marketing executive, was asked to roll the dice.
So the number is 2. So Officer Baker, why don't you take envelope number 2?
For the test, we selected Jessica Miller from the Houston Visitors Bureau to be what the scientists call the target person. Inside envelope number 2 was the photograph of the Houston Ship Channel. It would be Jessica's job to go to the target site and carefully observe every detail. In theory, through ESP, Joe might actually be able to see the location through Jessica's eyes. We would simultaneously record both Jessica and Joe. So while they drove, Joe began what he calls his cool-down period, similar to meditation, clearing his mind of all outside distractions. After 30 minutes, it was time for our test to begin. I had no knowledge of any of the locations.
We have been radioed that our crew and our target person are now on site. So I'm going to show you a picture. This is our target person. Have you ever seen her before?
No, I've never seen her before.
Describe for us the environment that she's in.
For television purposes, we've condensed the 15-minute session. Remember, these are the 4 locations in the envelopes. But all Joe knows is that the location is anywhere in Greater Houston.
First impression I'm getting is kind of a, I'm going to call it a river for lack of a better name. My sense is that it's both natural and man-made. So there's probably been something done to this river. It's been dredged or seawalls, formal walls have been put up of some kind.
I didn't know it, but within moments, with just a few strokes of his pen, Joe had eliminated not only our 3 other locations, but the infinite number of possible sites around Houston. Now the question became, how detailed could he get?
Many vertical lines that are perpendicular one to the other, but the horizontal lines seem to have curves to them. And the actual target itself is more on an incline.
Remember, at this moment, Joe is attempting to see what Jessica is seeing.
She's looking up. So there's something tall at the target. Keeps looking up at it. I want to say there's like a bridge nearby. My sense is the bridge isn't meant for traffic, it's meant only for people.
As you're going through this process, is this confined just to visual?
Some of it's visual, but some of it's also hearing or smells or taste or just sensations.
Towards the end of Joe's session, a huge cargo ship docked right in the middle of our location, dramatically altering the target site.
I'm just getting a lot of metallic noise. There's something else down here as well. It's a very, very large object. I don't think it's a building. I don't know what that is. But this is a very large object. Something tall behind the part of the entry. And then I get sort of almost a specifically designed platform. I get a feeling like there's a black stripe down the center of it or something. This is about probably all I'm going to get on this target.
It was now time to go to the target site. Remember, Joe's impressions included a bridge, a river improved by man, seawalls, a very large object, and lots of metallic noise. When we arrived, we met Jessica, and unbelievably, we saw what she saw. A bridge, a river improved by man, a very large object, and a barge used for dredging. This is scary. Take a look at that, and then take a look at the barge in the water, and the shape of that.
Which looks exactly like that structure.
Were you looking at that during the process?
I looked at that a lot because I, looked all down in that direction, so I did look at it a lot.
What really impresses me is large object. And I'm looking at this ship, and I can't believe it, because that's right on the nose. Now, in terms of the bridge, you said you thought it was more foot traffic than automobile.
That's obviously something got twisted, the interpretation. Generally speaking, about 80% of what I do say usually turns out to be correct.
Are you pleased with the way this turned out?
Yeah, I'm pleased. I think out of all the places that we could have been around Houston, this is very much fits the picture of the area.
About 20% of what Joe does is as close to spectacular as I could possibly wish. Scientists don't like to use the term miracle very often, but this is as close to one as you can imagine.
Coincidence, chance, or an extrasensory ability that exists in all of us. If you were skeptical, like I was, then perhaps what Joe McGonigal accomplished today opened all of our minds just a bit. Reporting from the Houston Ship Channel, I'm Bill McIntyre.
That producer was enormously skeptical about it. He thought this was a big waste of time and all a waste of money, blah, blah, blah. Here it is, 10 years later almost, and he's a pal. It really changed his career in some important ways. Now, before I leave you, look, I know of all the secrets that went on here in World War II, so I would like a show of hands. I'm about to reveal to you something that has never been revealed before, and it must not leave this room, okay? Show of hands, you all agree to that? Very good. This is an application of extrasensory perception that will change the world as you know it. Theoretical physicist with powers of extrasensory perception stealing a thought experiment from a colleague. It's been my great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. I think that was something different than we've ever had before.
Oh. Is that good or bad? I'll leave that to you to figure out.
Very, very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Sure, it's raised some thoughts. Have we any questions, queries, please?
Why Stargate, the name of the project?
Well, she asked why Stargate, the name of the program. You would think that there's some logic behind the way military chooses these programs. It's from a long list, and I'll tell you a brief story about it. One of the earlier names, my boss came out of the Pentagon and said, "Ed, you'll be really excited. We've named the project Quantum Leap." And I got really all down-faced, and I said, "You know, Colonel, out of all possible progress our project could make that was anything above zero, the smallest possible one is called Quantum Leap. Can't we find a better name?" So I wish there was some insight into that, but there isn't.
Have any luck with tracing any notorious criminals or...
Well, you saw one example. Well, you saw one of the one example, and there are others like that. For obvious reason, let me pose a hypothetical. Let's suppose Annie Johnson had just blew up the pyramids and was hiding out, and we found her. But she had a whole terrorist organization behind her. We wouldn't have a very long life expectancy now, would we? So it's a very good reason why the capacity, the projects that we did, and so on. But you can use your imagination with some of the examples that I've shown you about some of the applications we've done so far. Other questions?
Yes, tongue in cheek here.
Yeah?
Shouldn't the American and British governments have used this to find the weapons of mass destruction in Iran?
Well, our beloved Mr. President probably did, and that got him into so much trouble. A serious note. I have no knowledge about the use of this activity in today's troubled world. I hope that they are in fact using this somehow. Having said that, I sincerely doubt for political reasons and sociological reasons they are not.
How do you find the people that have this ability? Do you actually select groups and test them, or
Yes.
wait for somebody to pop up?
No, we actually select groups and test them. Mr. McMonigal was winnowed down from 3,000 intelligence officers in the United States Army, down to 6. Of those 6 that came to us, 4 produced laboratory quality, excellent ability. And those that are still doing this can still do it. The good news is they haven't lost their skill. The bad news is after 30 years, they're not any better than the day they walked into the office. That's very frustrating, I have to say. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Have you ever tested yourself?
Well, actually, I'm a robot. I stayed home in San Francisco. No, for a number of reasons. No, because it's such a controversial area. And what you have to do if one is investigating any area of controversy is attempt, although it's a human impossibility, to remain as objective as possible. So if I started doing this and was somehow magically good at it, no one would believe a word I said, and maybe you didn't believe a word I said anyway, so I might as well try it. So. Yes, sir.
Do you think it likely that some military commanders have had this naturally because there was an expression of the other side of the hill?
He asked, well, do I think it's likely military commanders? In fact, let me tell you a brief story. In the Vietnam era, the Army had a managerial problem, and they actually brought it to us. The managerial problem was, if you know when men go out on patrol, the poor bastard who's out in front is called a point man. And so the Army had all these statistics of what the average lifetime in combat of that poor person is. It's not very good. But in Vietnam, there were a handful of, I can't call them anything else, but wizards, who outlived their life expectancy by many orders of magnitude. And it became a managerial problem because the men wouldn't go out on patrol with anybody else but those wizards. Now, the real answer of why they survived is probably better training, they're better fit, they have, for whatever psychological reasons, better environmental sensitivity, and perhaps, and as it turned out, they may have a subliminal ability of extrasensory perception. Give you one brief example. In the 70s, a researcher went to a weekend seminar in New York City for training. It was a self-improvement seminar for executives. And there were Xerox executives and all the big corporations. And he embedded into a weekend-long series, he embedded a sort of fake ESP, or an ESP test, but didn't tell them about it. It was covert. The end of the day, with some caveats, which I'm leaving aside for dramatic purposes, at the end of the day, the executive salary correlated with their scores on the ESP test, but did not correlate with their belief in ESP. In short, the rough and very rough idea is that you get paid the big bucks for making slightly wiser decisions than the average person in the absence of an awful lot of data, and that's what a good executive is tasked of doing. So maybe, just maybe, there is a slight component of extrasensory perception in all of us, and those of us who are successful in our work of life, regardless of what that is, may have an ability, a slight ability in this direction. It's not large, but it is in fact measurable. Yes?
Did you ever test the wizard point men to find out if they were any better?
Yeah, you just saw a picture of one, Joe McMonigal. Yeah. Any others? Well, thank you. It's been a great privilege for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you show our appreciation of the usual. If I may, just a brief reminder about our next meeting, To confuse you, it is next week, not in 2 weeks' time. May the 5th, Brian Oakley, 60 years ago, VE Day, as we approach VE Day. And the following week, the replacement film show for the one we unfortunately had to cancel a little while ago. So the 5th, Brian Oakley, 12th, film show. And for those of you who have difficulty with the seats, the film show is going to be in the alternative venue. Thank you very much.